When I first read the text for this Sunday, I thought maybe we should just reread it and call it a day. It's so clear, isn't it? It's one of the most famous and most defining texts of the Christian faith. But because this passage is so central to our faith and so clear, I thought I would do something a little different today. I thought I would focus on what Jesus is not saying. Jesus is saying things so clearly, sometimes we interpret things that aren't there. And so I want to talk about what Jesus is not saying today. And to understand what Jesus is not saying, we'll need to put it into a context, the context that it's found. In this portion of Luke, which the lectionary has been following, we are hearing Jesus' Sermon on the Plain. In Matthew's Gospel, it's Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So the difference is it's just on a flat surface here. And in Luke's Gospel, we have just heard Jesus say his Beatitudes. Blessed are you who are poor, hungry, those who weep, those who are excluded and reviled. And woe to you who are rich, who gluttonously fill themselves with food, those who snicker at others, those who seek and receive haughty praise. It is on the heels of saying these things that Jesus immediately says, "But I say to you that listen," presumably those who are poor and hungry and excluded. He says to those people, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Really, Jesus? To those who are exhausted and oppressed, you tell them this? And this is our first, what Jesus is not saying. Jesus is not saying to these exhausted and oppressed folks just to suck it up. Jesus is not saying, look, you were born into this bad lot in life. Grin and bear it. Your reward will be in heaven. He's not saying that. If at first you heard this as the rich and haughty get away scot-free and the good working people have to take the high road, I don't think that's what Jesus is saying here. Rather, what Jesus is doing here is giving a caution, a warning to those he is talking to. Think of it like this. I know how easy it would be to turn into those who I just said woes against, to turn into those who seek after riches and gluttony, those who want to be better than others and receive petty praise. How do I know this is Jesus' sentiment? Well, later on in his passage, he says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same, and so on. Look, if you don't do what I'm saying, loving your enemies, but instead just love those who love you, then you're just like those who I proclaim the woes against, and you will go into misery. So Jesus isn't saying, suck it up. Rather, he's warning us in our exhaustion to not go down that wide path, that path of woe, and seek riches and extravagance, that fake power of superiority. That woe, that path of woe, leads to lasting misery. What's the second thing Jesus is not saying here? Well, again, we have to put things into context, and this time in our modern context. This passage is most famously used by most 20th century theologians and ethicists to argue pacifism. Now, if you're a pacifist, I'm not saying you're wrong. I think that you're most likely right here. I just don't think that us everyday folk necessarily understand pacifism in a nuanced way that Jesus is articulating. Sometimes when we hear this passage and also think of pacifism, we think that these two things go like this. Something bad happens to you, and in a calm and collected, almost Jedi Buddhist-like manner, we act as though it doesn't bother us, and we need to move on. Pacifism is so wrongly understood as unresponsive, as refraining from action. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. In fact, for every wrong done unto you, Jesus gives an action for you to respond with. For those who curse you, bless them. For those who mistreat you, pray for them. For those who strike you, stand back up and show them your other cheek. For those who take away your cloak, give them the shirt on your back. If Jesus is arguing pacifism, it's a resistant action-filled pacifism. It's a way of being in the world that stands up for what is right without falling into the cycles of brokenness, much like our little ones so well articulated. Think of it like this. Jesus is telling us not to back down from evil, but also don't become it. A good example of this is that my friend, who's a minister here in upstate New York, just 2 weeks ago had white supremacists, yes, literal self-described white supremacists who were leaving KKK pamphlets and white theology tracts around, protesting on the church property down the road. These white supremacists were cursing the town, striking the moral fabric of the community. They were calling for the end of immigration, the end of critical race theory, the end of the queer agenda. They were proclaiming the great replacement theory. Whites will be replaced by non-whites. What did the town and the churches in it do? Just let it go? No, yesterday they stood up for what is right. They turned their other cheek. Yesterday they held a community gathering, praying for the community and for those white supremacists. They made signs and shouted to the heavens that all are welcome and all belong in their town. This is the kind of action Jesus is saying to take when he says, turn the other cheek. You can think of it like this. Look, you've shown us that you don't like what we stand for by striking our cheek. Well, here's the other cheek for you to hit, because we're not backing down. So we've talked about Jesus giving us a truth, a caution, to not go down the path of woe. It only leads to more misery and exhaustion. We've also talked about Jesus' ideas of goodness, his ethics, not repaying evil with evil, as Paul summarizes it. But the last thing I want to talk about is also not explicitly articulated in the text, but it is implied, for sure. And what is that? Well, it answers the question, why live this way? We can comprehend the truth that Jesus is conveying. It's not really hard of a concept to grasp. And we can emotionally get why it's good to treat others how we might want to be treated. But is it compelling? If this passage is so central to the Christian faith, what about Jesus' teaching here makes us want to do this? After all, this is really tough. He's asking us to love our enemies. Why live this way? Well, you may think that Jesus kind of answers this question. In the last portion of today's text, he gives an economic answer. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. kind of a Christian understanding of karma, if you will. The good you put into the world is the good you will receive back. I would say that's partly the answer to why I live this way. But there is something bigger going on. There's something more beautiful going on. You see, what is implied in Luke and in all the other Gospels is that Jesus is the personification, the exemplar of what he's calling us to do. Jesus personifies his enemies, loving his enemies. So why live this way? Because it's the best way to live. Why live this way? Because it's the way to live a full life, to live a life like Jesus. A life worth living is a life where love wins, a life where love defeats enemies and evil, a life where the cycles of human brokenness are stymied and stopped by you, because you and others collectively stood for what is right. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about, an example near and dear to my heart. In 2015, I had the great privilege of studying abroad in Budapest, Hungary. And while I was there for 5 months, I got to intern at a small church, a Church of Scotland church named St. Columba's. Now, in the fall of 2015, when I was there, the height of the Syrian refugee crisis was taking place. And this tiny congregation was doing everything it could possibly do to help the literal tens of thousands of refugees who were sleeping on Hungarian railway stations' floors. They were handing out food and water, blankets, bus passes to Austria, you name it. One of the regular things they did was take women and children back to the sanctuary of the church, where they had built showers and beds to give them a safe place to rest and collect themselves. This was also to protect them from the Hungarian police, who were beating people at night. Now, why did this congregation do this, was my question. Why did this little church go this extra mile and stand up for what is right? The answer is a woman named Jane Haining. They were totally entranced by the life of this woman named Jane. Who is Jane? Well, in the early 1930s, Jane Haining decided to move from her homeland of Scotland to this small little church in Budapest, Hungary, as a missionary. There she joins the church at St. Columba's and becomes the head mistress of the boarding school. As an act of equity, the church was giving schooling to young girls in Budapest, particularly Christian and Jewish girls. By all accounts, Jane's life was all about her girls. As things started to get worse in Europe leading to World War II, the Church of Scotland sent her multiple letters requesting that she return home and that she was in danger. Her reply? If these girls needed me in days of sunshine, how much more will they need me in days of darkness? When the road of ease was presented to her, she stood for what she knew was right. Jane stayed in Budapest, and the war began. As things progressively got worse in Budapest, specifically that the 800,000 Hungarian Jews of the 1.2 million Jews who died at Auschwitz came from Budapest. She knew that Jews were being rounded up around her. And so what did Jane do? Jane started to house more and more Jewish girls, knowing full well what she was doing. With a secret committee that she helped put together, she also worked to take in Jewish refugees fleeing from other neighboring countries. On April 25th, 1944, Jane was written up on numerous charges, reportedly from the school chef who claimed that Jane had stolen some fruit. She hadn't, and I like to think that she let him have whatever produce she had left. If anyone takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. As far as the other charges she was charged with, she was charged that she had worked among the Jews, that she had wept when putting on the yellow stars of David on the girl's uniform. She was also charged that she was active in politics like her committee, along with some other charges. She did not refute this, but just prayed. Pray for those who mistreat you. After those charges were made, 2 Gestapo officers cuffed her at the church and started to take her away. There's this account of some of her Jewish girls running down the steps of the school, crying and asking where they were taking Miss Haining. She just quieted them, comforted them, hugged them, and told them she'll be all right. Jane was the personification to these girls of, do unto others as you would have them do to you. Jane Haining was taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, and on July 17, 1944, she died, most likely of starvation. On January 27, 1997, the Yad Vashem World Holocaust Memorial Remembrance Center in Israel recognized Jane as righteous amongst the nations. She is one of 2 Scots to be remembered and be recognized as such. There is no telling how many Jewish girls she saved, but estimates were at least more than 100. Friends, Jane understood today's text. She knew not to go down that path of woe, to seek riches and all those other things. She stood for what is right and resisted. And in so doing, she lived a life worth living, a righteous life. First Church, with violence threatened here at home and wars threatened in faraway places, don't go down the path of woe. Stand for what is right. Let love conquer. Love even your enemies. And in so doing, live that truly beautiful life, a life that looks like Christ. Amen.